person. I mean, but of course, with the Zoom facility, this allows us at least to interact over virtual space. It is my pleasure to be here. And just a small caveat, I'm not a linguist, so I'm a social geographer interested in the spatial politics of migration and diversity. So I will be speaking on that theme. And of course, the hope is that for linguists here, there could be something that would also resonate with yourselves and your research, and also an opportunity for me to learn a little bit more about what linguists do with migration studies. So let me now share screen. So first of all, to give me indication that I can be heard and that you will be able to see my screen. Is that?
Yes, we can see, Professor.
Okay, so let me just make some small adjustments because I can't see my own screen now. So, okay, so for today's lecture this morning, wait, it's not moving. So, okay, so for today, the topic that I would like to speak upon is on migration-led diversification in the global city. And I'll be drawing from examples, particularly from the Singapore examples. So here, the lecture is in 4 parts. I'll begin first by saying a little bit more about transnational migrations, diversity in cities, or if you like the particular neologism, diversity spelled with a CITIES as opposed to the usual way. So in this first part of the lecture, I just wanted to draw attention to the way that migration scholars have approached diversity. So it's important to note that migration research has evolved over the years, and whilst the more traditional kind of migration research done largely in the West has privileged more permanent forms of migration and issues of settlement, of adaptation and assimilation in host societies, migration studies today, particularly in the Asian context, has diversified considerably. So instead of focusing on permanent migration, you move from A to B and then you settle, and the politics that accompanies settlement, migration studies now look at many other different modes of migration, including more temporary modes of migration. And this has to do with the rapid advancements in transport and communication technologies, as well as we all know, the flexibilization of contemporary life and work cultures under capitalist conditions. And here, this has led to migration becoming a much more provisional form of existence. So in Asia in particular, we are interested in the more temporary modes of migration. So people move more temporarily, they sojourn in different places, often without a very clear pathway towards residency and settlement in host societies. And often these pathways are not permitted in many of the host societies in Asia. So in that sense, movement, population mobility is with a deep sense of provisionality and sometimes with no end goal in mind. Even the question of returning to your country of origin is also often provisional. My colleague in NUS, Anju Paul, has called this multinational migration, a term that she uses to capture the movements of international migrants that move to more than one overseas destination. We had a workshop a few years ago on the question of multinational migrations. And what was interesting to me is that in that particular workshop, many new terms to describe migration were generated. And these could, as you see on the screen, onward migration, secondary migration, stepwise migration, stepping stone migration, serial migration, triangular, twice, step down, crosswise. So an indication of the fact that migration patterns are no longer a simple move from A to B, but proliferating in very diverse ways. So this is the context of migration studies today. And another important element in studying migration is the fact that migration is no longer a privilege pathway, only reserved for the elites, or only reserved for those with considerable resources. Yes, migration is an expensive business, but it's also now a household livelihood strategy for many people, including the not so well-off. And it's also a pathway to express personal aspirations and to express future aspirations for people, particularly those belonging to the lower social economic strata. It is now within the reach of a broader spectrum of socioeconomic classes. So again, here you see the spectrum of migration pathways and types of migration proliferating. It now includes professional managerial elites that circulate from global city to global city. Migrant contract workers would be the predominant in terms of numbers. We also have refugees and undocumented migrants, student migrants, marriage migrants, retirement migrants, or lifestyle migrants, and also frequent flyers. Before the pandemic, of course, the budget airlines were doing a roaring business. And here you see the Air Asia tagline, which I think speaks to this question of the increased spectrum of people who are involved in migration. It says, now everyone can fly. This is within the reach of a much larger spectrum of people of different socioeconomic classes. So moving very quickly then to the cities. These are cities that receive migrants or cities of migration. And here we see that the contemporary global city is often at the intersection of multiple migrations. So it's a meeting place of different kinds of migrants converging on a particular space and in a sense trying to echo a living in these spaces. There are different approaches to studying the contemporary global city, the city of migration. I'll just point to one, which is to look at contact zones, the contact zones between migrants and locals. These are the social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with one another. Another of my colleagues at NUS, Jane Jacobs, quoting Barth, puts it this way, that the city is a crucible of anticipated and unanticipated encounters. And this is the very place of our meeting with the other. This is where, in a sense, we meet with a very diverse other. So in this light, in the social science literatures, including social geography, there's been a large and growing literature on the social cultural texture of globalizing cities that receive migrants. Here, again, it's important to point to the different approaches to understanding difference. And I'll just, in a sense, move to speak a little bit about the post-structuralist approaches that looks at difference not as fixed, but notions of difference as always interrelational, inessential, incomplete, fluid, and destabilized. I think Beck puts it very well, talks about this being a move from the either-or kind of classification of difference to a new logic of not only, but also, right? So, and Nina Glickschiller also puts it, I think, very well, that diversity is no longer about fixed differences. Diversity is often about overlapping multiplicities. So in that sense, similarity and diversity, sameness and diversity and difference basically exists along a continuum of overlapping multiplicities and is not, in a sense, separable into fixed boxes. So to conclude this section, I just wanted to, in a sense, summarize what I've been trying to say is that in the light of multiple migrations, the city is not just a container where differences encounter each other, but as Isen says, it is not just the passive backdrop, it is a city that actively generates differences and assembles identities. So here we have in the global city, different groups different groups of migrants, of locals that encounter each other, and they encounter each other by taking up positions, orienting themselves for and against each other, inventing and assembling strategies and technologies, mobilizing various forms of capital, and in order to make claims to that space that is called the city. So whether it's a diversity of peoples from different groups passing each other on the streets, as you see in one of the pictures, or migrant groups, in this case, migrant domestic workers, taking up position in the city and, in a sense, making use of different kinds of strategies in order to claim a particular space in the city. So these are the kinds of the ways in which the city generates differences and assembles identities. So moving on then to the second part of the talk, I want now to focus a little bit more on Singapore. And here the theme is the way that old diversities meets new diversities in the post-colonial nation city state. So as I think most people here would know, Singapore and Southeast Asia in general is sandwiched between the large polities of China and India. And Southeast Asia is a terrain arena that, in a sense, is influenced by a very long history of migrations, of mobilities and circulations that range from merchants, monks, sailors, rebels to the coolie trade, as Paul Nairi and Danielle Tan puts it in their book. This is, in the case of Singapore, that emerged as a British trading post in the early 19th century and has, in a sense, moved always in this mode of becoming a global city. It is very clear that Singapore as a city-state has its fate and fortunes very deeply intertwined with this migration history. To cut a long story short, in the early 19th century, when Singapore was founded as a trading emporium, it had what could be called a very cosmopolitan demography and culture and landscape that's governed through what's called pragmatic tolerance of plural societies. So in short, according to Furnival's theory of plural societies, Singapore had many different groups on the island. So in that sense, it's very diverse, but each group holds by its own culture and way of life. They only meet as individuals in the marketplace in buying and selling. So it's only in the marketplace, in the economic sphere, that there are interactions. Otherwise, each group is, in a sense, governed on its own with its own social norms, forms, and ways of being. And this is reflected in the map of Singapore under Raffles. This is a map that Raffles commissioned, and it shows basically the different ethnic precincts or kampongs that are, in a sense, given to each of the groups as separate entities. The Chinese have their own kampongs, the Malays, their own kampong, the Indians, and of course, it's only Europeans that occupy what's called the town area. Fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, when Singapore gained independence in 1965. In the immediate post-colonial nation building phase, this is the 60s and 70s, the national elites at that time were faced with the backdrop of this plural society with racialized categories that are hardened by colonial policy, because colonial policy basically treated each group as separate, as different, and discouraged interrelationships between different groups. So the new national leaders had a hard job of trying to weld together these heterogeneous groups into the so-called one people. And they did so using the premise of an ideology, on the premise of the ideology of what's been called separate but equal multiracialism. And this is best reflected in the stamp, Singapore, many races, one people, or as depicted in the particular flag, with children as representatives of the different racial ethnic groups. Four of them, in a sense, holding hands and in unity singing the national anthem. So this form of nation building that is based on a discourse of multiracialism has been, in a sense, the founding philosophy in Singapore and still continues till today. Under multiracialism, there are 4 official races that are designated: Chinese, Malays, Indians, and others, often known as CMIO multiracialism, right? And it's a little bit more complicated than multiracialism. If you like, it's called the discourse of 4 M's: multiracialism, multiculturalism, multilingualism, and multireligiosity. And the idea here is that these are 4 racial groups, each of them hold by their own cultures, their own traditions, and for the linguists here, of course, their own language. So each group is assigned a particular language. And yet the supposed idea here is that these different communities would, in a sense, live together separately but equally on a level playing field without discrimination for any particular community. So at least that's the so-called ideal. Here you see one of the examples of multilingualism. There are 4 official languages, each tied to one particular racial group: saya, awak, kita, wo, ni, woman. I don't speak Tamil, so I can't pronounce that. I'm sure there's someone here who probably could do it. And English is seen as the common language, the social glue, that the lingua franca that in a sense allows for all different groups to participate in national life. So this is, in a sense, the ideal kind of multiracialism as a way of pulling together a diverse society. Again, fast forward now to the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Here you see different dynamics, social dynamics happening. And one of these had to do with declining fertility rates amongst the citizen population, amongst all 4 racial groups. The decline is fastest amongst the Chinese and Indians, but even the Malay population is, in a sense, experiencing declining fertility rates to below replacement rates. So being a global city means that you need to have the manpower, the human power rather, to, in a sense, run the city. So here, the state then came up with labor augmentation programs through aggressive immigration policies in order to sustain the economic life of the city. So this is a labor short city, so migration then became an important component of ensuring the supply of labor, and that eventually led to a high degree of what I call migration-led diversity. So this is not the old diversity of the 4 racial communities, not the old ideologically sort of run multiracialism. This is another kind of diversity that's, in a sense, tied to migration. And of course, by the 20th century, the end of the 20th century into the 21st century, these new transnational migrations are facilitated by modern transportation, the budget airlines that we saw earlier on, and of course, communication technologies. And as depicted in this particular cartoon, people from all kinds of backgrounds, from all continents, basically parachuting into Singapore to create Diversity Singapore. And if you look at the population statistics over 10 years, so this is the pre-COVID kind of situation. So COVID has meant that the population migration has basically been affected, but I won't go into that in this particular lecture, but of course, I'll be happy to discuss the pandemic situation later. But in a pre-pandemic situation, over 10 years, from 2008 to 2018, the population actually grew from 4.5 million to 5.6, 5.7 million. And so this is humongous growth. But what's also interesting is the composition of this population. As you can see in red, that represents the Singapore citizens. In 2008, it was 68%. By 2018, it's been reduced to 62%, which then means that more than a third of the people on the island of Singapore are non-citizens, either permanent residents, the 9%, but the bulk of them that's represented in gray by the 29%, these are called non-residents. They are basically the migrants that, in a sense, I'm going to be talking about. This is just to show you that for the resident population, not the migrants, but the resident population, the racial arithmetics, if you like, the ethnic composition of Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others have shifted a little bit, but not much over the post-independence years, right? So the Chinese majority is moved from about 77% in 1970 to 74% in 2018. So it's dropped a little bit. So have the Indians, so have the Malays, basically. And we see small increases in the Indian and other categories. So these are the small changes in the racial arithmetic of the resident population. But what's important is not just the diversity of the CMIO population, but the main point of the talk today is to focus on not so much the old CMIO diversity, but to look at the additional layer that's been superimposed on the city in terms of a new migrant-led diversity. And that we need to look at the green segment. So as you can see in this particular diagram, out of a population of about 5.7 in pre-pandemic days, more than a third of the population are these non-residents, these migrants that range from domestic workers, work permit holders, like construction workers, manual workers, to employment pass holders. These will be the skilled and highly skilled, as well as student migrants and so forth. Okay, so that's to set the context for the next section of my talk, which now focuses more specifically on the spaces of appearance of migrant concentrations, right? So as already mentioned, Singapore, in a sense, is a magnet for many different streams of migrants. And to put it very simply, the way the migrant subjects are incorporated into the nation state, into the nation's geobody, follows basically bifurcated lines. So it's different strokes for different folks in some ways, and it's a differentiated form of incorporation of migrants into the city. For talent migrants, and I'm simplifying a complex kind of hierarchy by, in a sense, just talking about two basic groups: the talent migrants, those who are highly skilled professionals and entrepreneurs. These are often incentivized to take up permanent residency or even citizenship, or to lay down roots. The idea here is that they contribute their talent and the skills, and are migrants that, in a sense, help Singapore grow its economic pie. At the other end of the spectrum are the so-called labor migrants, particularly those who are less skilled, unskilled, or performing 3D jobs, the demeaning, difficult, and dangerous jobs. These migrants also contribute, of course, to the economy, but they are often treated as subjects of transience. They are locked into this rotating door regime that enforces transience. So in pictorial form, this is the contrast between the three men that you see in business suits and tie, and the three men that you see perched precariously on Singapore's, this is actually the esplanade, or what we call the durians. They do work and contribute to Singapore, but they come in on very different conditions, and they treated with different degrees of transience. For today, I'm just going to be focusing on the three men that are perched up on the durian, who have precarious jobs, right? I'm going to ignore the men in business suits for today. So for these men, in this case, they're all men doing construction work. The vast majority of these lowly paid migrant workers are admitted into the city-state as transient and disposable labor. Pathways to residency and citizenship are not available. Maybe 0.001% of the possibility. So the idea here is that they should come in, contribute the labor, and then return home in this kind of rotating door, contract-based kind of work regime. What this means is that, and these would be the larger numbers, right? In Singapore, we have over 300,000 construction workers. And if you think of all the less skilled jobs put together, we have more than 1 million of these lowly paid, less skilled migrant workers doing 3D jobs. So what this sets up for the city is a contradiction between this very large migrant population that, in a sense, occupies spaces in the city. They are supposed to be transient according to the work regime, and yet they are often palpably visible as migrant concentrations, particularly on days off during the weekends when they're not at their work sites. So these migrant concentrations then, under this kind of temporary migration regime, raises all kinds of social anxieties and sometimes moral panics amongst the local population that then feeds the need to tighten and control and, in a sense, put these workers under strict surveillance. And just to illustrate that it's not just migrant men working in the construction industry, but also our migrant domestic workers, of which there are about 250,000 of foreign domestic workers in Singapore, and these work in the household as live-in domestic workers. But on the day offs, these workers, and in this case, they're all female, would be in the city spaces, in this case, along Orchard Road, and they form these ephemeral spaces of enclavization, these kinds of temporary enclaves, or what we call weekend enclaves, that are formed and unformed through a variety of practices, tensions, dynamics, and politics. I won't be speaking about this theme today, just to note that these kinds of weekend enclaves, these kinds of foreign worker gatherings are often viewed negatively by the local population, and the authorities are often asked to step up measures to relocate them to out-of-sight locations. Totally not practical, but it tells you a little bit of the sentiment of wanting to keep the population out of sight, relocating them to offshore islands. Residents of public housing flats have also put up sea barricades to keep the workers out. And you see in the picture on the extreme right, the deployment auxiliary police.
Dr. Yeoh,
Yes.
we can't quite hear you.
Yeah. I think
Brenda got disconnected.
Yeah, so we'll just wait for her to go back.
Okay.
it's dangerous if she doesn't realize she was disconnected.
Do you
Ariana?
have
Yeah,
her
it's-
number?
She's back.
No, as Loy was saying, if you have a number, send her a message or else send her a quick email. And
I
maybe
think
give
just
us
a quick email. She's back.
Okay,
Oh, okay.
okay.
Professor. Oh, there, she's back.
Jason.
Yeah, she's
Professor Brenda, you're now co-host again. You can unmute.
Hello, hello.
yes.
Hi.
Really not sure what happened, so very sorry about that.
Okay.
Let me then try to pick up from where I left off. Am I right to say that I was talking about the poster in the middle?
Yes.
Yes, particularly the extreme right image. That's where
Okay.
we lost you.
I see. So, okay, so extreme right, I was in a sense pointing out that this is one of the measures of control of migrant workers in Little India is the deployment of auxiliary police, right, to move them on when they settle on the public spaces. Is that, can I move on to the middle picture, which is to do with the particular sign that says no littering and so forth? As I was saying, these kinds of signs are not uncommon in Singapore. No littering, fine $500. But this sign in Little India is of particular interest because it's also in the language that caters to the migrant workers in the Bangladeshi and Indian populations. And it's not just no littering, but also no sleeping, no eating, no urinating, and no littering. And of course, the migrant workers can also ignore it. As you see in the picture, migrant workers sleeping just below the poster itself. Anyway, so the idea here is that these weekend enclaves are written with all kinds of control measures to try to control the migrant population. But this came to a head in 2013, in December 2013, when a riot broke up amongst the foreign workers in Little India. This happened when a male Indian national, a construction worker, died after being hit by a bus that was supposed to be ferrying the workers back to their dormitories. And this led to angry mobs of about 300 migrant workers being involved in the riot. So riots are very uncommon in Singapore. So of course, this one created the headlines. In terms of the committee of inquiry that was formed in order to look into the riot, they pointed to issues like misunderstandings, the culture of the crowd, and also particularly to alcohol and intoxication. Well, I mean, public debates basically went a bit further to say that it's not just to do with the psychology of the crowd or intoxication, but it also has to do with many of these embedded migrant worker issues like overcrowding, like increasing ethnic tensions, the working and living conditions of the workmen themselves. These needs to be looked into. So to cut a long story short, in the aftermath of the Little India riot, Little India became a space of exception. Alcohol sales were banned, and there was increased police surveillance, including the increase in auxiliary police being sent to monitor Little India as a particular site. Again, things have changed quite a lot with the pandemic, but I won't be talking about that for now. Let me then move on to say that in the face of the riot in particular, the state came up with different kinds of strategies of containment. And one of these has to do with setting up of dormitories. So it's not a new strategy, but it was given increased importance after the riot when a new mega dormitory was set up in Tuas. And this is Singapore's biggest dormitory. It had 16,800 beds, but it doesn't just house the workers, but also contain all kinds of recreational options, from cinemas to cricket fields to, and you'll see in the picture here, okay, not this one. This one shows the location, the peripheral location of the dormitories on Singapore Island. But this picture shows the kinds of facilities that are provided from not just beds, but washing, barber, money transfer, skills training, and so forth. The idea is that the mega dormitory will be self-contained so that workers no longer need to, in a sense, venture to Little India to send remittances and so forth. These spaces were also spaces of control and surveillance. You probably can't read the house rules of this particular dormitory, but it will range from no alcohol, no smoking, no cooking, no feeding of stray animals, no gambling, and of course, no use of vulgar words, and lights out by 11 p.m. So it's like staying in a hostel, basically. So these are the kinds of control and surveillance measures that are imposed on the migrant worker population in order to contain these workers and keep them away from the public spaces where they tend to congregate on their on the Sundays and weekends. On the other hand, so the migrant worker story is not just about control, it's also about care and cosmopolitan hope, because with the increase in the migrant population over the last 15, 20 years, rights and rights-based as well as welfare organizations for migrant workers have also emerged. And these, in my view, are now the leading edges in progressive development within civil society. And what these NGOs do is to, in a sense, provide services such as soup kitchens that you see in the pictures there. Used to be able to bring my students down to these soup kitchens during the pre-COVID days. It also involves setting up shelters, training centers, and so forth. There's a smaller number of them that also advocate on behalf of the migrant workers, but they are in the minority. In 2016, the state also set up the Center for Domestic Employees to look after the needs of the domestic workers. These are based on a tripartite system and is meant to encourage balance, as it says, a balanced and pragmatic approach towards issues and a harmonious way of resolving issues based on mutual understanding and respect. So much of the language of is not of conflict, but of collaboration and concern. I just wanted to show you this small clip, or at least parts of this small clip, because it's not just the state that has an interest in creating more services for the migrant workers in our midst, but also individuals. In this case, Wajiha Hamid and her sister. Wajiha used to be a research assistant in the Asia Research Institute. So she made this little video called Parallel Paths to show how, in a sense, Singaporean, particularly younger generation, have been motivated to engage with migrant workers. Okay, I'm very bad at setting this off, so I'm not sure whether it will play. Hopefully so. Tell me if you're not seeing it. So can I have an indication that you're seeing and hearing it?
Yes, it's good, Brenda.
Okay, good.
Hi,
Hi, I'm Waji. Together with my sister Aisha, we are two ordinary Singaporean sisters that enjoy doing small acts of kindness from the ground up. We started with Adopt a Camera campaign. Members of public were encouraged to donate a disposable camera, and they were also asked to decorate the cameras, and we got 33 cameras. Following that, 18 migrant men and 15 locals were brought around on an excursion. It started off in Little India, followed by Chinatown and East Coast. Each of them received a disposable camera, and they were split up into groups comprising of migrant workers as well as Singaporeans. And they went around taking pictures of what the themes meant to them.
To Chinatown now, and I'm getting to know Central better, and we're answering like questions like how long he's been in Singapore and like how his family is.
Two particular men were really excited about going into a temple, and they shared with me and some of the other volunteers that they have never been inside a Chinese temple despite working here for many years. It was an eye-opening experience for them as well as for us. We often see them as just someone working on a construction site or someone who's crowding out space in Little India. So this is another side to the men that we don't often see unless we interact with them or we hear their stories. A week later, we gathered at Art Space to look through all the pictures, and then they discussed about what the pictures meant to them.
This is Dendil. He's taken this picture because he's never been inside a Chinese temple before. That's why he took this picture. Hey, this is Sagar. This is one of his favorite shots. It reminds him of fishing back in Bangladesh.
This is Mukhtar, and he really likes this picture because it reminds him of his son in Bangladesh.
Imran took this picture and he likes it because it shows an old couple who is still very much in love with each other.
This is Udin, and he likes this picture because it shows of him and his Singaporean friends, and they are very happy together.
The pictures will be exhibited at Art Space, and the public are welcome to view it. I hope that when people come and view the exhibition, they are able to see through the eyes of these migrant workers. And though our paths may run parallel to each other, coming from different places, different backgrounds, we do share the same hopes and dreams as each other.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now, how do I get beyond this particular slide? Okay. So that basically concludes the third part of the talk, which focuses on migrant workers and their place in Singapore society, looking both at state efforts to control and care for the men, as well as individual. I hope you got a glimpse of the kinds of individual encounters with migrant men that stems from efforts from people like Waji and her sister. I now want to move on quickly to look at another major migrant population in Singapore, which are the migrant domestic workers. Here, I'm interested in how migrant diversities are implicated in the politics of hyphenation in intimate home spaces. So a little bit of background, I already mentioned that in Singapore, fertility rates have plummeted, as with many of the other developed nation states in Asia, and is well below replacement rate. So we've seen in the earlier slides, the impact on the labor force. Here, I want to look at the impact on the family and household. So we see here in that chart, falling fertility rates amongst all the four racial groups in total, so is well below a replacement level by now. In Singapore, I think the overall fertility rate, I believe, is only about 1.1, when replacement is actually 2.1. So this has aggravated the trend of rapid aging in Singapore society, and families are also becoming smaller. So the elderly dependency ratio has increased, and this has important consequences for the care that families provide to the elderly parents. Another important element has to do with women's growing participation in the workforce. So in Singapore, the female labor force participation rate is quite high, which then means that women shoulder the triple burden of building their own careers, child raising, and now with the aging issues, with elder care as well. So as we see on supermarket shelves, it's no longer just baby diapers, but elderly care kind of diapers that are now part and parcel of what you purchase in your grocery as a household, because many households have now elderly parents to care for. So women's work has become even more challenging, right? Not least because the household division of labor over the years have still remained rigidly bound to gender norms. It's still women who basically look after children and care for the elderly alongside building their own careers. So this, in a sense, leads to a crisis of care, a crisis of care deficits in many households in Asian societies like Singapore. The family in Singapore elsewhere have always been seen as the main source of support for the elderly. And with this elder care crisis, families have turned to, in a sense, purchasing care and importing care labor. So for the better resourced families, much of the caregiving has now been devolved to foreign domestic workers, particularly for families where it's dual income, dual career. In order to maintain middle-class lifestyles, the foreign domestic worker is now an important component of the household. And in fact, 1 in 5 families in Singapore, which means that the bulk of the middle-class households all have a live-in domestic worker. Imiko Ochai from Kyoto University has coined this phrase, liberal familialism, to describe this kind of phenomenon, where the cost of purchasing care labor is borne by the family. It's a family that pays for the domestic worker, but filial piety, the traditional form of filial piety, is now outsourced to others whose services are bought from across international borders. So you see here an Indonesian domestic worker watching a TV program with the elderly Singaporean employer, whilst her children are presumably at work during the workday. So if this has been a live audience, I would usually ask a question, what program you think they are watching, given that the Indonesian domestic worker and the more elderly Singaporean employer don't speak the same language and don't understand the same language. What program would they be watching together? I won't be able to get a response because of the format that's been set up, but I don't know, because I don't know what they're watching, but my guess is that it's going to be Korean drama, because Korean drama can be understood across all language groups, even if you don't speak the language. So that's the answer that most of my students normally give. I'll skip this one because, again, that needs more live interaction, but I now want to show you a short clip, basically a trailer of this award-winning movie called Ilo Ilo, that is the first Singapore-made movie first Singapore director to win the Golden Camera Award at the Cannes Festival. It's called Ilo Ilo, and which is a province in the Philippines, but more, I think, evocative is a Chinese title, which is 爸妈不在家, which means father, mother not at home. So again, it's about how the foreign domestic worker basically becomes an important component of care work within the family. So I just want to, in a sense, show you the short trailer. This is the Asian financial crisis.
You can call me Sherry, ma'am. This is your bed. Sleep here. Huh? Terry, give me your passport.
干嘛拿人家 passport 啊？
把那个人跑掉了。
You can see 啊。喂，哎，
做什么你？我干嘛碰？I am your maid. I didn't come here to be bullied. Emma, go and do your work, don't be careful. Jalan. Your hair very tall. I help you wash your hair. Oi, Jalan, stop. Mami, 给 Auntie Terry 站这边。Teresa, I'm his mother, not you.
How long have you been out of job for? 2 months. Maybe.
Yes.
你当妈妈，你整天就会看穿你老公啊？
你不可以脚踏实地一点，安分守己一点。
可是我已经没有。
在什么局势做什么生意，
那你就
可以不要
不要
讲了吗？
老王，我们有话要跟你说。
你干什么啊？
Right, so this particular trailer, I think, shows the many aspects of life when a domestic worker is inserted within the family. And I thought linguists appreciate it, given that it is in multiple languages. What happened, this is actually based on a true life story, Anthony Chen's own growing up years, being cared for by a domestic worker. Basically the story ends when the parents lost their jobs during the Asian financial crisis. And when the parents lost their job, Auntie Terry also lost her job and she returned back to the Philippines. There is a long story. We were fortunate enough to invite Anthony Chen to a particular dialogue, and he told us how he went then in search of Auntie Terry, the so-called Auntie Terry, and there's a long story behind this, but I think I better move on with what I want to focus on today. So just to say, if you haven't seen Ilo, please do watch it. Yeah. Okay. So coming back to the lecture here, I want to, in a sense, talk about the care deficit within the family and how this is plugged. So it's by outsourcing domestic and care work to Southeast Asian women, Indonesian and Filipino domestic workers, that the more privileged Singaporean women and families trade in their class privileges for at least partial freedom from the burden of household reproductive labor. And of course, the men still continue to abdicate their household responsibilities in this exchange that's largely between women. What is important for this lecture is that this is also a form of diversification, but this time within the intimacy of the Singapore household. And care functions are increasingly dependent on international migration for sustenance. You saw in that particular movie, the female employer saying to Terry, "I'm his mother, not you." So this is, in a sense, also a question of what happens to parenting when care is diversified. So I want to, in a sense, go on to another group of women who are migrants. These are the marriage migrants. And here I turn to away from middle-class families who are wealthy enough to recruit migrant domestic workers for householding purposes to working class families. So working class families, what do you do? if you don't have the wherewithal to employ a domestic worker, and yet both parents have to work. So one way is by drawing on unpaid, in this case, care labor, by recruiting foreign brides. So we see that, again, a little bit of background with the expanding educational and career opportunities in Singapore. Women have risen to the occasion. So many women have done well in the education pathways and gotten career opportunities. But who is, in a sense, positionally left behind by local women's participation in the workforce are the Singaporean men from the lower socioeconomic strata. This is because in Asia, hypergamy basically means that women marry up and men marry down. So for these Singaporean men in blue-collar jobs, for example, they have done a sort of project on this. They would tell me that it's very difficult in the Singaporean marriage market, because to find a wife, basically, someone who would marry them, because they don't earn very much, and they need the woman to perform care work. So they then look to women from the less developed countries in the region, particularly Vietnam, but also Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth. Women who are willing to take on, so-called more traditional women who are willing to take on procreation and caring roles in sustaining the household. The picture there is a Vietnamese bride matchmaking agency, young women, basically in their early 20s, who are, in a sense, at the matchmaking agency, waiting for Singaporean men to come in to see whether there can be a match. So my point here in terms of migration diversity is that this then also introduces diversity now, this time into the primary relationships that constitute the family. And over the last few years, cross-nationality marriages that involves a Singapore citizen and a foreign spouse, and more often than not, a foreign woman, now accounts for about 30%, right, of all marriages that are registered each year in Singapore. As the news article says, there are now more mixed unions in Singapore involving foreign women from China, Vietnam, and parts of Southeast Asia. What's interesting is this picture that I took of the Best Match Marriage Consultants. This is their short front. This is a matchmaking agency that brings in particularly Vietnamese women. The selling logo title is there. It says, "A Vietnam wife is keen to do household chores and is willing to take care of parents wholeheartedly." So there's an important tagline, because Singapore women apparently are no longer willing to do that. So whereas supposedly, according to this matchmaking agency, Vietnamese women are still willing to fill that kind of role. So to fast forward again, with the increase in international marriage in Singapore, there were also some policy changes that were instituted to reflect this phenomenon of mixed marriages. So in 2010, there was a policy innovation to allow children of mixed marriages to choose, or rather the parents would choose for them, either to adopt the race of the father, the race of the mother, or to use double-barreled race classifications in official documents. In Singapore, all of us have an official race that's on our IC. So what happens when your mother is Vietnamese and your father is Singaporean Chinese? What do you put? So this particular innovation, so-called innovation, is to cater for that. And the Prime Minister, when announcing this particular change, says that this kind of hyphenation is, in a sense, pushed by the significant number of Singaporeans marrying across racial lines. He says the couple is considered carefully what the identity of the child would be. Will they be a Chinese kid, an Indian kid, maybe European, maybe Japanese, maybe Vietnamese, right? So, and he points to the fact that many Singaporeans have married Vietnamese spouses. So the policy is meant to give parents some degree of choice in identity politics to avoid situations like below. That particular kind of cartoon says that if you're asked to select your race, someone with a Chinese mother and a Indian father could take Chinese, Indian, and as well as others as Chindian, right? So these are the kinds of different permutations and combinations that are now in place because of this policy of hyphenation. Yet at the same time, this liberalization identity politics is a limited one. It allows for some degree of choice, but it actually doesn't widen the base for claims making to gain cultural rights. Why? Because in all other policies, you still have to say which is your dominant or primary race, which you need to put before the hyphen. And all government policies, whether it's language policies, housing policies, all that, will use that primary race before the hyphen in their in the regulations and policy making. So the question I have for the class, if you're interested, is whether this active recognition of hyphenated identities provides a step forwards for more flexible thinking about race, about cultivating cosmopolitan sensibilities, about accommodating difference, or is it very limited because it doesn't actually widen the base for claims making? So this is a question to think about. We also have other kinds of mixed races that are more sort of traditional, like Eurasians or Paranakans, but I won't go into that for today. So in my conclusion, come to a quick conclusion. My main point is that we need to rethink the politics of diversity and migration across different spaces, both the public spaces like we saw in the migrant concentrations and weekend enclaves, but also in the private spaces of intimacy and care, because in Singapore's case and in the case of many global cities, the other may be strange and unfamiliar, but may also be intimate and even familiar. So it's important to remember that public civility that's governed by often ritualized codes of etiquette may not always be the litmus test for private prejudices and moralities. So in order for Singapore and any other global city to develop a cosmopolitan urban ethic, it's important to look at not just its streets, but also the intimacies of its homes. These need to become places of self-knowledge and not fear. For Singapore, and I'll end with this particular slide, there are many perplexities as well as opportunities, because Singapore is both a nation state as well as a global city. As a nation state, on an island is bounded by the nature of island geography. There's a need, a demand for closure of defining its borders in order to build a nation. So closure is supposedly symptomatic of nation state formation. At the same time, being a global city, and this is true throughout Singapore's history and also given its future ambitions to join the ranks of global cities, there is an important imperative towards openness. There's a need to become a hub for transnational flows of people, ideas, and commodities. So it's in between these two tensions of closure and openness that Singapore has to carve a way out for its future. And the Prime Minister a few years ago in a speech made on Singapore Day in London, basically hints at that Singapore needs to, in a sense, get the balance just right between national identity and cosmopolitan openness, between free market competition and social solidarity. So with that, I conclude the lecture. And of course, if there are questions, I'll be happy to take them if there's time.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Brenda Yeoh. That was very wonderful. I don't know what kind of superlative I need to use to express how good the lecture was. It was a good